The people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Apple's Think Different commercial, 1997.
Introduction. How this book came to be. In the early summer of 2004, I got a phone call from Steve Jobs. He had been scattershot friendly to me over the years, with occasional bursts of intensity, especially when he was launching a new product that he wanted on the cover of Time, or featured on CNN, places where I'd worked. But now that I was no longer at either of those places, I hadn't heard from him much. We talked a bit about the Aspen Institute, which I had recently joined, and I invited him to speak at our summer campus in Colorado. He'd be happy to come, he said, but not to be on stage. He wanted instead to take a walk so that we could talk. That seemed a bit odd. I didn't yet know that taking a long walk was his preferred way to have a serious conversation. It turned out that he wanted me to write a biography of him. I had recently published one on Benjamin Franklin and was writing one about Albert Einstein, and my initial reaction was to wonder, half jokingly, whether he saw himself as the natural successor in that sequence. Because I assumed that he was still in the middle of an oscillating career that had many more ups and downs left, I demurred. Not now, I said. Maybe in a decade or two, when you retire. I had known him since 1984, when he came to Manhattan to have lunch with Time's editors and extol his new Macintosh. He was petulant even then, attacking a Time correspondent for having wounded him with a story that was too revealing. But talking to him afterward, I found myself rather captivated, as so many others have been over the years, by his engaging intensity. We stayed in touch, even after he was ousted from Apple. When he had something to pitch, such as a next computer or a Pixar movie, the beam of his charm would suddenly refocus on me, and he would take me to a sushi restaurant in Lower Manhattan to tell me that whatever he was touting was the best thing he had ever produced. I liked him. When he was restored to the throne at Apple, we put him on the cover of Time, and soon thereafter he began offering me his ideas for a series we were doing on the most influential people of the century. He had launched his Think Different campaign, featuring iconic photos of some of the same people we were considering, and he found the endeavor of assessing historic influence fascinating. After I had deflected his suggestion that I write a biography of him, I heard from him every now and then. At one point, I emailed to ask if it were true, as my daughter had told me, that the Apple logo was an homage to Alan Turing, the British computer pioneer who broke the German wartime codes and then committed suicide by biting into a cyanide-laced apple. He replied that he wished he had thought of that, but that he hadn't. That started an exchange about the early history of Apple, and I found myself gathering string on the subject, just in case I ever decided to do such a book. When my Einstein biography came out, he came to a book event in Palo Alto and pulled me aside to suggest, again, that he would make a good subject. His persistence baffled me. He was known to guard his privacy, and I had no reason to believe that he'd ever read any of my books. Maybe someday, I continued to say. But in 2009, his wife, Lorene Powell, said bluntly, "If you're ever going to do a book on Steve, you'd better do it now." He had just taken a second medical leave. I confessed to her that when he had first raised the idea, I hadn't even known he was sick. "Almost nobody knew," she said. "He had called me right before he was going to be operated on for cancer, and he was still keeping it secret," she explained. I decided then to write this book. Jobs surprised me by readily acknowledging that he would have no control over it, or even the right to see it in advance. "It's your book," he said. "I won't even read it." But later that fall, he seemed to have second thoughts about cooperating, and though I didn't know it, he was hit by another round of cancer complications. He stopped returning my calls, and I put the project aside for a while. Then, unexpectedly, he phoned me late on the afternoon of New Year's Eve of 2009. He was at home in Palo Alto with only his sister, the writer Mona Simpson. His wife and their 3 children had taken a quick trip to go skiing, but he was not healthy enough to join them. He was in a reflective mood, and we talked for more than an hour. He began by recalling that he had wanted to build a frequency counter when he was 12, and he was able to look up Bill Hewlett, the founder of HP, in the phone book and call him to get parts. Jobs said the past 12 years of his life, since his return to Apple, had been his most productive in terms of creating new products. But his more important goal, he said, was to do what Hewlett and his friend David Packard had done, which was to create a company that was so imbued with innovative creativity that it would outlive them. I always thought of myself as a humanities person as a kid, but I liked electronics, he said. Then I read something that one of my heroes, Edwin Land of Polaroid, said about the importance of people who could stand at the intersection of humanities and sciences, and I decided that's what I wanted to do. It was as if he were suggesting themes for his biography, and in this case at least, the theme turned out to be valid. The creativity that can occur when a feel for both the humanities and the sciences combine in one strong personality was a topic that most interested me in my biographies of Franklin and Einstein, and I believe that it will be a key to creating innovative economies in the 21st century. I asked Jobs why he wanted me to be the one to write his biography. "I think you're good at getting people to talk," he replied. That was an unexpected answer. I knew that I would have to interview scores of people he had fired, abused, abandoned, or otherwise infuriated, and I feared he would not be comfortable with me getting them to talk. And indeed he did turn out to be skittish when word trickled back to him of people that I was interviewing. But after a couple of months, he began encouraging people to talk to me, even foes and former girlfriends. Nor did he try to put anything off limits. "I've done a lot of things I'm not proud of, such as getting my girlfriend pregnant when I was 23 and the way I handled that," he said. "But I don't have any skeletons in my closet that can't be allowed out." He didn't seek any control over what I wrote or even ask to read it in advance. His only involvement came when my publisher was choosing the cover art. When he saw an early version of a proposed cover treatment, he disliked it so much that he asked to have input in designing a new version. I was both amused and willing, so I readily assented. I ended up having more than 40 interviews and conversations with him. Some were formal runs in his Palo Alto living room. Others were done during long walks and drives or by telephone. During my 2 years of visits, he became increasingly intimate and revealing, though at times I witnessed what his veteran colleagues at Apple used to call his reality distortion field. Sometimes it was the inadvertent misfiring of memory cells that happens to us all. At other times he was spinning his own version of reality, both to me and to himself. To check and flesh out his story, I interviewed more than 100 friends, relatives, competitors, adversaries, and colleagues. His wife also did not request any restrictions or control, nor did she ask to see in advance what I would publish. In fact, she strongly encouraged me to be honest about his failings as well as about his strengths. She is one of the smartest and most grounded people I've ever met. There are parts of his life and personality that are extremely messy, and that's the truth, she told me early on. You shouldn't whitewash it. He's good at spin, but he also has a remarkable story, and I'd like to see that it's all told truthfully. I leave it to the listener to assess whether I have succeeded in this mission. I'm sure there are players in this drama who will remember some of the events differently or think that I sometimes got trapped in Jobs' distortion field. As happened when I wrote a book about Henry Kissinger, which in some ways was good preparation for this project, I found that people had such strong positive and negative emotions about Jobs that the Rashomon effect was often evident. But I've done the best I can to balance conflicting accounts fairly and to be transparent about the sources I used. This is a book about the roller coaster life and searingly intense personality of a creative entrepreneur whose passion for perfection and ferocious drive revolutionized 6 industries. personal computers, animated movies, music, phones, tablet computing, and digital publishing. You might even add a seventh, retail stores, which Jobs did not quite revolutionize, but he did reimagine. In addition, he opened the way for a new market for digital content based on apps rather than just websites. Along the way, he produced not only transforming products, but also, on his second try, a lasting company endowed with his DNA that is filled with creative designers and daredevil engineers who could carry forth his vision. In August 2011, right before he stepped down as CEO, the enterprise he started in his parents' garage became the world's most valuable company. This is also, I hope, a book about innovation. At a time when the United States is seeking ways to sustain its innovative edge and when societies around the world are trying to build creative digital age economies, Jobs stands as the ultimate icon of inventiveness, imagination, and sustained innovation. He knew that the best way to create value in the 21st century was to connect creativity with technology. So he built a company where leaps of the imagination were combined with remarkable feats of engineering. He and his colleagues at Apple were able to think differently. They developed not merely modest product advances based on focus groups, but whole new devices and services that consumers did not yet even know they needed. He was not a model boss or human being, tidily packaged for emulation. Driven by demons, he could drive those around him to fury and despair. But his personality and passions and products were all interrelated, just as Apple's hardware and software tended to be, as if part of an integrated system. His tale is thus both instructive and cautionary, filled with lessons about innovation, character, leadership, and values. Shakespeare's Henry V, the story of a willful and immature prince who became a passionate but sensitive, callous but sentimental, inspiring but flawed king, begins with the exhortation, "Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention." For Steve Jobs, the ascent to the brightest heaven of invention begins with a tale of two sets of parents and of growing up in a valley that was just learning how to turn silicon into gold.
Childhood. Abandoned and chosen. When Paul Jobs was mustered out of the Coast Guard after World War II, he made a wager with his crewmates. They had arrived in San Francisco, where their ship was decommissioned, and Paul bet that he would find himself a wife within 2 weeks. He was a taut, tattooed engine mechanic, 6 feet tall, with a passing resemblance to James Dean. But it wasn't his looks that got him a date with Clara Hagopian, a sweet-humored daughter of Armenian immigrants. It was the fact that he and his friends had a car, unlike the group she had originally planned to go out with that evening. 10 days later, in March 1946, Paul got engaged to Clara and won his wager. It would turn out to be a happy marriage, one that lasted until death parted them more than 40 years later. Paul Reinhold Jobs had been raised on a dairy farm in Germantown, Wisconsin. Even though his father was an alcoholic and sometimes abusive, Paul ended up with a gentle and calm disposition under his leathery exterior. After dropping out of high school, he wandered through the Midwest, picking up work as a mechanic until at age 19 he joined the Coast Guard, even though he didn't know how to swim. Clara was born in New Jersey, where her parents had landed after fleeing the Turks in Armenia, and they moved to the Mission District of San Francisco when she was a child. She had a secret that she rarely mentioned to anyone. She had been married before, but her husband had been killed in the war. So when she met Paul Jobs on that first date, she was primed to start a new life. Clara loved San Francisco, and in 1952 she convinced her husband to move back there. There was, however, something missing in their lives. They wanted children, but Clara had been unable to have any. So by 1955, after 9 years of marriage, they were looking to adopt a child. Like Paul Jobs, Joanne Schabel was from a rural Wisconsin family of German heritage. As a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, she fell in love with Abdul Fattah John Jandali, a Muslim graduate student and teaching assistant from Syria. In the summer of 1954, Joanne went with Abdul Fattah to Syria. They spent 2 months in Homs, where she learned from his family to cook Syrian dishes. When they returned to Wisconsin, she discovered that she was pregnant. They were both 23, but they decided not to get married. Her father was dying at the time, and he had threatened to disown her if she wed Abdul Fattah. Nor was abortion an easy option in a small Catholic community. So in early 1955, Joanne traveled to San Francisco, where she was taken into the care of a kindly doctor who sheltered unwed mothers, delivered their babies, and quietly arranged closed adoptions. Joanne had one requirement. Her child must be adopted by college graduates. So the doctor arranged for the baby to be placed with a lawyer and his wife. But when a boy was born on February 24, 1955, the designated couple decided that they wanted a girl and backed out. Thus it was that the boy became the son not of a lawyer, but of a high school dropout with a passion for mechanics and his salt-of-the-earth wife who was working as a bookkeeper. Paul and Clara named their new baby Stephen Paul Jobs. When Joanne found out that her baby had been placed with a couple who had not even graduated from high school, she refused to sign the adoption papers. The standoff lasted weeks, even after the baby had settled into the Jobs household. Eventually, Joanne relented, with the stipulation that the couple promise, indeed sign a pledge, to fund a savings account to pay for the boy's college education. There was another reason that Joanne was balky about signing the adoption papers. Her father was about to die, and she planned to marry Jandali soon after. She held out hope, she would later tell family members, sometimes tearing up at the memory, that once they were married, she could get their baby boy back. Arthur Schabel died in August 1955 after the adoption was finalized. Just after Christmas that year, Joanne and Abdul Fattah were married in St. Philip the Apostle Catholic Church in Green Bay. He got his Ph.D. in international politics the next year, and then they had another child, a girl named Mona. After she and Jandali divorced in 1962, Joanne embarked on a dreamy and peripatetic life that her daughter, who grew up to become the acclaimed novelist Mona Simpson, would capture in her book Anywhere But Here. Because Steve's adoption had been closed, it would be 20 years before they would all find each other. Steve Jobs knew from an early age that he was adopted. My parents were very open with me about that, he recalled. He had a vivid memory of sitting on the lawn of his house when he was 6 or 7 years old, telling the girl who lived across the street. "So does that mean your real parents didn't want you?" the girl asked. Lightning bolts went off in my head, according to Jobs. I remember running into the house crying, and my parents said, "No, you have to understand." They were very serious and looked me straight in the eye. They said, "We specifically picked you out." Both of my parents said that and repeated it slowly for me, and they put an emphasis on every word in that sentence. Abandoned, chosen, special. Those concepts became part of who Jobs was and how he regarded himself. Later in life, when he was the same age his biological father had been when he abandoned him, Jobs would father and abandon a child of his own. Chris Ann Brennan, the mother of that child, said that being put up for adoption left Jobs full of broken glass, and it helps to explain some of his behavior. Jobs dismissed this. There's some notion that because I was abandoned, I worked very hard so I could do well and make my parents wish they had me back or some such nonsense, but that's ridiculous, he insisted. Knowing I was adopted may have made me feel more independent, but I have never felt abandoned. I've always felt special. My parents made me feel special. He would later bristle whenever anyone referred to Paul and Clara Jobs as his adoptive parents or implied that they were not his real parents. They were my parents, 1,000%, he said. When speaking about his biological parents, on the other hand, he was curt. They were my sperm and egg bank. That's not harsh. It's just the way it was. A sperm bank thing. Nothing more. Silicon Valley. The childhood that Paul and Clara Jobs created for their new son was in many ways a stereotype of the late 1950s. When Steve was 2, they adopted a girl they named Patty, and 3 years later they moved to a tract house in the suburbs. There Paul tried to pass along his love of mechanics and cars. "Steve, this is your workbench now," he said, as he marked off a section of the table in their garage. Jobs remembered being impressed by his father's focus on craftsmanship. "I thought my dad's sense of design was pretty good," he said, because he knew how to build anything. If we needed a cabinet, he would build it. When he built our fence, he gave me a hammer so I could work with him. 50 years later, the fence still surrounds the back and side yards of the house in Mountain View. It was important, his father said, to craft the backs of cabinets and fences properly, even though they were hidden. His father continued to refurbish and resell used cars, and he festooned the garage with pictures of his favorites. "I wasn't that into fixing cars," Jobs admitted, "but I was eager to hang out with my dad." One day when he was about 8, he discovered a photograph of his father from his time in the Coast Guard. "He's in the engine room and he's got his shirt off and looks like James Dean." It was one of those "oh wow" moments for a kid. Wow, oh, my parents were actually once very young and really good looking. The Jobs' house and the others in their neighborhood were built by the real estate developer Joseph Eichler. Inspired by Frank Lloyd Wright's vision of simple, modern homes for the American everyman, Eichler built inexpensive houses that featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls, open floor plans, exposed post and beam construction, concrete slab floors, and lots of sliding glass doors. Jobs said that his appreciation for Eichler homes instilled in him a passion for making nicely designed products for the mass market. "I love it when you can bring really great design and simple capability to something that doesn't cost much," he said, as he pointed out the clean elegance of the houses. It was the original vision for Apple. What made the neighborhood different from the thousands of other spindly tree subdivisions across America was that even the ne'er-do-wells tended to be engineers. "When we moved here, there were apricot and plum orchards on all of these corners," Jobs recalled, "but it was beginning to boom because of military investment. The first computer terminal I ever saw was when my dad brought me to the NASA Ames Research Center," he said. "I fell totally in love with it." In the wake of the defense industries, there arose a booming economy based on technology. Its roots stretched back to 1938, when Dave Packard and his new wife moved into a house in Palo Alto that had a shed where his friend Bill Hewlett was soon ensconced. By the 1950s, Hewlett-Packard was a fast-growing company making technical instruments. By the time Jobs was 10, HP had 9,000 employees and was the blue-chip company where every engineer seeking financial stability wanted to work. The most important technology for the region's growth was, of course, the semiconductor. The chip industry gave the region a new name when Don Heffler, a columnist for the weekly trade paper Electronic News, began a series in January 1971 entitled Silicon Valley, USA. The 40-mile Santa Clara Valley, which stretches from South San Francisco through Palo Alto to San Jose, has as its commercial backbone El Camino Real, the royal road that once connected California's 21 mission churches and is now a bustling avenue that connects companies and startups accounting for a third of the venture capital investment in the United States each year. Growing up, I got inspired by the history of the place, Jobs said. That made me want to be a part of it. Most of the dads in the neighborhood did really neat stuff, like photovoltaics and batteries and radar, Jobs recalled. The most important of these neighbors, Larry Lang, lived 7 doors away. He took a carbon microphone and a battery and a speaker, and he put it on this driveway. He had me talk into the carbon mic, and it amplified out of the speaker. Jobs had been taught by his father that microphones always required an electronic amplifier. So I raced home, and I told my dad that he was wrong. Jobs recalled the incident vividly because it was his first realization that his father did not know everything. It was a very big moment that's burned into my mind. When I realized that I was smarter than my parents, I felt tremendous shame for having thought that. I will never forget that moment. This discovery, he later told friends, along with the fact that he was adopted, made him feel apart, detached and separate from both his family and the world. Another layer of awareness occurred soon after. Not only did he discover that he was brighter than his parents, but he discovered that they knew this. Both my parents got me. They felt a lot of responsibility once they sensed that I was special. They found ways to keep feeding me stuff and putting me in better schools. So he grew up not only with a sense of having once been abandoned, but also with a sense that he was special. School. Even before Jobs started elementary school, his mother had taught him how to read. This, however, led to some problems once he got to school. I was kind of bored for the first few years, so I occupied myself by getting into trouble. His school, Monta Loma Elementary, was a series of low-slung 1950s buildings 4 blocks from his house. He countered his boredom by playing pranks. I had a good friend named Rick Ferrantino, and we'd get into all sorts of trouble, he recalled. Like we made little posters announcing, "Bring your pet to school day." It was crazy, with dogs chasing cats all over, and the teachers were beside themselves. When he was in 3rd grade, the pranks became a bit more dangerous. One time we set off an explosive under the chair of our teacher, Mrs. Thurman. We gave her a nervous twitch. He skipped a grade and went from Monta Loma Elementary to Crittenden Middle. Jobs was often bullied, and in the middle of 7th grade he gave his parents an ultimatum. I insisted they put me in a different school, he recalled. So they researched where the best schools were and scraped together every dime and bought a house for $21,000 in a nicer district. The move was only 3 miles to the south to a former apricot orchard in Los Altos that had been turned into a subdivision of cookie-cutter tract homes. Their house at 2066 Christ Drive was 1 story with 3 bedrooms and an all-important attached garage with a roll-down door facing the street. There, Paul Jobs could tinker with cars and his son with electronics. When I moved here, these corners were still orchards, Jobs pointed out as we walked in front of his old house. The guy who lived right there taught me how to be a good organic gardener and to compost. He grew everything to perfection. I never had better food in my life. That's when I began to appreciate organic fruits and vegetables. Even though they were not fervent about their faith, Jobs' parents wanted him to have a religious upbringing. So they took him to the Lutheran church most Sundays. That came to an end when he was 13. In July 1968, Life magazine published a shocking cover showing a pair of starving children in Biafra. Jobs took it to Sunday school and confronted the church's pastor. "If I raise my finger, will God know which one I'm going to raise even before I do it?" The pastor answered, "Yes, God knows everything." Jobs then pulled out the Life cover and asked, "Well, does God know about this and what's going to happen to those children?" "Steve, I know you don't understand, but yes, God knows about that." Jobs announced that he didn't want to have anything to do with worshiping such a God, and he never went back to church. The juice goes out of Christianity when it becomes too based on faith rather than on living like Jesus or seeing the world as Jesus saw it, he told me. I think different religions are different doors to the same house. Sometimes I think the house exists, and sometimes I don't. It's the great mystery. One summer, Paul took Steve to Wisconsin to visit the family's dairy farm. Rural life did not appeal to Steve, but one image stuck with him. He saw a calf being born, and he was amazed when the tiny animal struggled up within minutes and began to walk. It was not something she had learned, but it was instead hardwired into her, he recalled. A human baby couldn't do that. I found it remarkable, even though no one else did. He put it in hardware-software terms. It was as if something in the animal's body and in its brain had been engineered to work together instantly rather than being learned. In 9th grade, Jobs went to Homestead High, which had a sprawling campus of 2-story cinder-block buildings painted pink that served 2,000 students. It was designed by a famous prison architect, Jobs recalled. They wanted to make it indestructible. It was a time when the geek and hippie worlds were beginning to show some overlap. "My friends were the really smart kids," he said. "I was interested in math and science and electronics. They were too, and also into LSD and the whole counterculture trip." His pranks by then typically involved electronics. At one point, he wired his house with speakers, but since speakers can also be used as microphones, he built a control room in his closet where he could listen in on what was happening in other rooms. One night, when he had his headphones on and was listening in on his parents' bedroom, his father caught him and angrily demanded that he dismantle the system. He spent many evenings visiting the garage of Larry Lang, the engineer who lived down the street from his old house. Lang got him into the Hewlett-Packard Explorers Club, a group of 15 or so students who met in the company cafeteria on Tuesday nights. They would get an engineer from one of the labs to come and talk about what he was working on, Jobs recalled. "I saw my first desktop computer there. It was called the 9100A, and it was a glorified calculator, but also really the first desktop computer. It was huge, maybe 40 pounds, but it was a beauty of a thing. I fell in love with it." The kids in the Explorers Club were encouraged to do projects, and Jobs decided to build a frequency counter, which measures the number of pulses per second in an electronic signal. He needed some parts that HP made, so he picked up the phone and called the CEO. Back then, people didn't have unlisted numbers, so I looked up Bill Hewlett in Palo Alto and called him at home. And he answered and chatted with me for 20 minutes. He got me the parts, but he also got me a job in the plant where they made frequency counters. His work mainly consisted of him just putting nuts and bolts on things on an assembly line. There was some resentment among his fellow line workers toward the pushy kid who had talked his way in by calling the CEO. I remember telling one of the supervisors, "I love this stuff. I love this stuff." And then I asked him what he liked to do best, and he said, "To fuck. To fuck." Jobs had an easier time ingratiating himself with the engineers who worked one floor above. Jobs liked to work. He also had a newspaper route. His father would drive him when it was raining, and during his sophomore year spent weekends and the summer as a stock clerk at a cavernous electronics store, Hall Tech. Out in the back near the bay, they had a fenced-in area with things like Polaris submarine interiors that had been ripped and sold for salvage, he recalled. All the controls and buttons were right there. The colors were military greens and grays, but they had these switches and bulb covers of amber and red. There were these big old lever switches that when you flipped them, it was awesome, like you were blowing up Chicago. Jobs was able to get his first car, with his father's help, when he was 15. In retrospect, a Nash Metropolitan might seem like the most wickedly cool car, he later said. But at the time, it was the most uncool car in the world. Still, it was a car, so that was great. Within a year, he had saved up enough from his various jobs that he could trade up to a red Fiat 850 coupe with an Abarth engine. That same summer, between his sophomore and junior years at Homestead, Jobs began smoking marijuana. I got stoned for the first time that summer. I was 15 and then began using pot regularly. At one point, his father found some dope in his son's Fiat. "What's this?" he asked. Jobs coolly replied, "That's marijuana." That was the only real fight I ever got in with my dad. He wanted me to promise that I'd never use pot again, but I wouldn't promise. In fact, by his senior year, I was starting to get stoned a bit more. We would also drop acid occasionally, usually in fields or in cars. He also flowered intellectually during his last 2 years in high school and found himself at the intersection, as he had begun to see it, of those who were geekily immersed in electronics and those who were into literature and creative endeavors. I started to listen to music a whole lot, and I started to read more outside of just science and technology, Shakespeare, Plato. I loved King Lear. One course that Jobs took would become part of Silicon Valley lore. The electronics class taught by John McCollum, a former Navy pilot who had a showman's flair for exciting his students with such tricks as firing up a Tesla coil. Mr. McCollum felt that electronics class was the new auto shop. McCollum believed in military discipline and respect for authority. Jobs didn't. Jobs took McCollum's class for only 1 year, rather than the 3 that it was offered. He was far more interested in playing with lasers, something he learned from his father. With a few friends, he created light shows for parties by bouncing lasers off mirrors on the speakers of his stereo system. Odd Couple. The Two Steves. Woz. While a student in McCollum's class, Jobs became friends with a graduate who was the teacher's all-time favorite and a school legend for his wizardry in the class. Stephen Wozniak was almost 5 years older than Jobs and far more knowledgeable about electronics. But emotionally and socially, he was still a high school geek. Like Jobs, Wozniak learned a lot at his father's knee. Francis Wozniak, known as Jerry, was a brilliant engineering graduate from Caltech who became a rocket scientist at Lockheed. I remember him telling me that engineering was the highest level of importance you could reach in the world, Steve Wozniak later recalled. It takes society to a new level. By 4th grade, Wozniak became, as he put it, one of the electronics kids. He had an easier time making eye contact with a transistor than with a girl, and he developed the chunky and stooped look of a guy who spends most of his time hunched over circuit boards. Getting shocked was a badge of honor for Woz. He once devised a roulette game where 4 people put their thumbs in a slot. When the ball landed, one would get shocked. Hardware guys will play this game, but software guys are too chicken, he noted. During his senior year, he got a part-time job at Sylvania and had the chance to work on a computer for the first time. Then he studied the specs for the latest microchips and tried to redesign the computers using these newer parts. The challenge he set himself was to replicate the design using the fewest components possible. I was now designing computers with half the number of chips the actual company had in their own design, but only on paper. After arriving at the University of Colorado in the fall of 1969, he spent so much time playing pranks, such as producing reams of printouts saying "fuck Nixon," that he failed a couple of his courses and was put on probation. So he transferred to De Anza Community College back home. After a pleasant year at De Anza, Wozniak took time off to make some money. He found work at a company that made computers for the California Motor Vehicle Department, and a coworker made him a wonderful offer. He would provide some spare chips so Wozniak could make one of the computers he had been sketching on paper. Much of the work was done in the garage of a friend just around the corner, Bill Fernandez, who was still at Homestead High. When it was finished, Fernandez told Wozniak there was someone at Homestead High he should meet. "His name is Steve. He likes to do pranks like you do, and he's also into building electronics like you are." It may have been the most significant meeting in a Silicon Valley garage since Hewlett went into Packard's 32 years earlier. Steve and I just sat on the sidewalk in front of Bill's house for the longest time, just sharing stories, mostly about pranks we'd pulled, and also what kind of electronic designs we'd done, Wozniak recalled. We had so much in common. Typically, it was really hard for me to explain to people what kind of design stuff I worked on, but Steve got it right away. And I liked him. He was kind of skinny and wiry and full of energy. Jobs was also impressed. "Woz was the first person I'd met who knew more electronics than I did," he once said, stretching his own expertise. "I liked him right away. I was a little more mature than my years, and he was a little less mature than his, so it evened out. Woz was very bright, but emotionally, he was my age." In addition to their interest in computers, they shared a passion for music. "It was an incredible time for music," Jobs recalled. "It was like living at a time when Beethoven and Mozart were alive." In particular, Wozniak turned Jobs onto the glories of Bob Dylan. Hunting down Dylan tapes soon became a joint venture. Jobs had formed a club at Homestead High to put on music and light shows and also play pranks. Even though they had already graduated, Wozniak and his friend Alan Baum joined forces with Jobs at the end of his junior year to produce a farewell gesture for the departing seniors. Showing off the Homestead campus 4 decades later, Jobs paused at the scene of the escapade and pointed. "See that balcony? That's where we did the banner prank that sealed our friendship." On a big bedsheet Baum had tie-dyed with the school's green and white colors, they painted a huge hand flipping the middle finger salute. The prank became part of school lore and got Jobs suspended one more time. The Blue Box. The ultimate combination of pranks and electronics, and the escapade that helped to create Apple, was launched one Sunday afternoon when Wozniak read an article in Esquire that his mother had left for him on the kitchen table. It was September 1971, and he was about to drive off the next day to Berkeley, his 3rd college. The story, Ron Rosenbaum's Secrets of the Little Blue Box, described how hackers and phone phreakers had found ways to make long-distance calls for free by replicating the tones that routed signals on the AT&T network. No one had ever created a digital version of a blue box, but Woz was made for the challenge. "I have never designed a circuit I was prouder of," he said. "I still think it was incredible. One night, Wozniak drove down from Berkeley to Jobs' house to try it. They attempted to call Wozniak's uncle in Los Angeles, but they got a wrong number. It didn't matter. Their device had worked. At first, the blue box was used for fun and pranks. The most daring of these was when they called the Vatican and Wozniak pretended to be Henry Kissinger wanting to speak to the Pope. They realized that Woz wasn't Henry Kissinger, Jobs recalled. We were at a public phone booth. It was then that they reached an important milestone, one that would establish a pattern in their partnerships. Jobs came up with the idea that the blue box could be more than merely a hobby. They could build and sell them. The parts cost about $40, and Jobs decided they should sell it for $150. Following the lead of other phone freaks such as Captain Crunch, they gave themselves handles. Wozniak became Berkeley Blue. Jobs was Oaf Tobark. The fun and profits came to an end at a Sunnyvale pizza parlor. Jobs and Wozniak were about to drive to Berkeley with a blue box they had just finished making. Jobs needed money and was eager to sell, so he pitched the device to some guys at the next table. They were interested, so Jobs went to a phone booth and demonstrated it with a call to Chicago. The prospects said they had to go to their car for money, so we walk over to the car, Woz and me, and I've got the blue box in my hand, and the guy gets in, reaches under the seat, and he pulls out a gun, Jobs recounted. He had never been that close to a gun, and he was terrified. So he's pointing the gun right at my stomach, and he says, "Hand it over, brother." My mind raced. There was the car door here, and I thought maybe I could slam it on his legs and we could run, but there was this high probability that he would shoot me. So I slowly handed it to him, very carefully. The partnership paved the way for what would be a bigger adventure together. If it hadn't been for the blue boxes, there wouldn't have been an Apple, Jobs later reflected. I'm 100% sure of that. The blue box adventure established a template for a partnership that would soon be born. Wozniak would be the gentle wizard coming up with a neat invention that he would have been happy just to give away, and Jobs would figure out how to make it user-friendly, put it together in a package, market it, and make a few bucks. The Dropout. Turn on, tune in. Chris Ann Brennan. Toward the end of his senior year at Homestead in the spring of 1972, Jobs started going out with a girl named Chris Ann Brennan, who was about his age but still a junior. As Brennan later said, "Steve was kind of crazy. That's why I was attracted to him." Jobs' craziness was of the cultivated sort. He had begun his lifelong experiments with compulsive diets, eating only fruits and vegetables, so he was as lean and tight as a whippet. He learned to stare at people without blinking, and he perfected long silences punctuated by staccato bursts of fast talking. He shuffled around and looked half mad, recalled Brennan. He had a lot of angst. It was like a big darkness around him. Jobs had begun to drop acid by then, and he turned Brennan onto it as well, in a wheat field just outside of Sunnyvale. It was great, he recalled. I had been listening to a lot of Bach. All of a sudden, the wheat field was playing Bach. It was the most wonderful feeling of my life up to that point. That summer of 1972, after his graduation, he and Brennan moved to a cabin in the hills above Los Altos. "I'm going to live in a cabin with Chris Ann," he announced to his parents one day. His father was furious. "No, you're not," he said, "over my dead body." They had recently fought about marijuana, and once again the younger Jobs was willful. He just said goodbye and walked out. Brennan spent a lot of her time that summer painting. She was talented, and she did a picture of a clown for Jobs that he kept on the wall. Jobs wrote poetry and played guitar. He could be brutally cold and rude to her at times, but he was also entrancing and able to impose his will. He was an enlightened being who was cruel, she recalled. That's a strange combination. Reed College. 17 years earlier, Jobs' parents had made a pledge when they adopted him. He would go to college. But Jobs, becoming ever more willful, did not make it easy. He insisted on applying only to Reed College, a private liberal arts school in Portland, Oregon, that was one of the most expensive in the nation. Reed had only 1,000 students, half the number at Homestead High. It was known for its free-spirited, hippie lifestyle, which combined somewhat uneasily with its rigorous academic standards and core curriculum. 5 years earlier, Timothy Leary, the guru of psychedelic enlightenment, had sat cross-legged at the Reed College Commons while on his League for Spiritual Discovery, LSD, college tour, during which he exhorted his listeners, "Like every great religion of the past, we seek to find the divinity within. These ancient goals we define in the metaphor of the present. Turn on, tune in, drop out." When it came time for Jobs to matriculate in the fall of 1972, his parents drove him up to Portland, but in another small act of rebellion, he refused to let them come on campus. "It's one of the things in life I really feel ashamed about. I didn't want anyone to know I had parents. I wanted to be like an orphan who had bummed around the country on trains and just arrived out of nowhere, with no roots, no connections, no background." In late 1972, there was a fundamental shift happening in American campus life. The nation's involvement in the Vietnam War and the draft that accompanied it was winding down. Political activism at colleges receded, and in many late-night dorm conversations was replaced by an interest in pathways to personal fulfillment. Jobs found himself deeply influenced by a variety of books on spirituality and enlightenment, most notably Be Here Now, A Guide to Meditation and the Wonders of Psychedelic Drugs by Baba Ram Das, born Richard Alpert. "It was profound," Jobs said. "It transformed me and many of my friends." The closest of those friends was another wispy, bearded freshman named Daniel Kotke, who met Jobs a week after they arrived at Reed and shared his interest in Zen, Dylan, and acid. Steve had a TIAC reel-to-reel and massive quantities of Dylan bootlegs, Kotke recalled. He was both really cool and high-tech. Jobs started spending much of his time with Kotke and his girlfriend Elizabeth Holmes, even after he insulted her at their first meeting by grilling her about how much money it would take to get her to have sex with another man. They created a meditation room in the attic crawl space above Elizabeth Holmes's room and fixed it up with Indian prints, a doori rug, candles, incense, and meditation cushions. There was a hatch in the ceiling leading to an attic which had a huge amount of space, Jobs said. "We took psychedelic drugs there sometimes, but mainly we just meditated." Jobs' engagement with Eastern spirituality and especially Zen Buddhism was not just some passing fancy or youthful dabbling. His intensity, however, made it difficult for him to achieve inner peace. He and Kotke enjoyed playing a 19th century German variant of chess called Kriegspiel, in which the players sit back to back. Each has his own board and pieces and cannot see those of his opponent. A moderator informs them if a move they want to make is legal or illegal, and they have to try to figure out where their opponent's pieces are. "The wildest game I played with them was during a lashing rainstorm sitting by the fireside," recalled Holmes, who served as moderator. "They were tripping on acid. They were moving so fast I could barely keep up with them." Another book that deeply influenced Jobs during his freshman year was Diet for a Small Planet by Francis Moore Lappé. which extolled the personal and planetary benefits of vegetarianism. I got into it in my typical nutso way, he said. Vegetarianism and Zen Buddhism, meditation and spirituality, acid and rock, Jobs rolled together in an amped-up way the multiple impulses that were hallmarks of the enlightenment-seeking campus subculture of the era. And even though he barely indulged it at Reed, there was still an undercurrent of electronic geekiness in his soul that would someday combine surprisingly well with the rest of the mix. Robert Friedland. In order to raise some cash one day, Jobs decided to sell his IBM Selectric typewriter. He walked into the room of the student who had offered to buy it, only to discover that he was having sex with his girlfriend. Jobs started to leave, but the student invited him to take a seat and wait while they finished. I thought, this is kind of far out, Jobs later recalled. And thus began his relationship with Robert Friedland, one of the few people in Jobs's life who were able to mesmerize him. Friedland was 4 years older than Jobs, but still an undergraduate. He had a room off campus above a garage, and Jobs would go there many afternoons to seek him out. He was entranced by the apparent intensity of Friedland's conviction that a state of enlightenment truly existed and could be attained. He turned me on to a different level of consciousness, Jobs said. On Sunday evenings, Jobs and Friedland would go to the Hare Krishna temple on the western edge of Portland, often with Kotke and Holmes in tow. They would dance and sing songs at the top of their lungs. We would work ourselves into an ecstatic frenzy, Holmes recalled. Robert would go insane and dance like crazy. Steve was more subdued, as if he was embarrassed to let loose. Then they would be treated to paper plates piled high with vegetarian food. Friedland had stewardship of a 220-acre apple farm about 40 miles southwest of Portland that was owned by an eccentric millionaire uncle from Switzerland. After Friedland became involved with Eastern spirituality, he turned it into a commune called the All One Farm, and Jobs would spend weekends there with Kotke, Holmes, and like-minded seekers of enlightenment. Steve ran the apple orchard, said Friedland. We were in the organic cider business. Steve's job was to lead a crew of freaks to prune the orchard and whip it back into shape. Friedland began operating the commune more as a business. It started to get very materialistic, Jobs recalled. Everybody got the idea they were working very hard for Robert's farm, and one by one they started to leave. I got pretty sick of it. Many years later, after Friedland had become a billionaire copper and gold mining executive working out of Vancouver, Singapore, and Mongolia, I met him for drinks in New York. That evening I emailed Jobs and mentioned my encounter. He telephoned me from California within an hour and warned me against listening to Friedland. He said that when Friedland was in trouble because of environmental abuses committed by some of his mines, he had tried to contact Jobs to intervene with Bill Clinton, but Jobs had not responded. Robert always portrayed himself as a spiritual person, but he crossed the line from being charismatic to being a con man, Jobs said. It was a strange thing to have one of the spiritual people in your young life turn out to be, symbolically and in reality, a gold miner. Drop out. Jobs quickly became bored with college. I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and no idea how college was going to help me figure it out. And here I was, spending all of the money my parents had saved their entire life. So I decided to drop out and trust that it would all work out okay. The minute I dropped out, I could stop taking the required classes that didn't interest me and begin dropping in on the ones that looked interesting, he said. Among them was a calligraphy class that appealed to him after he saw posters on campus that were beautifully drawn. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. It was yet another example of Jobs consciously positioning himself at the intersection of the arts and technology. In all of his products, technology would be married to great design, elegance, human touches, and even romance. In the meantime, Jobs eked out a bohemian existence on the fringes of Reed. He went barefoot most of the time, wearing sandals when it snowed. Elizabeth Holmes made meals for him, trying to keep up with his obsessive diets. He returned soda bottles for spare change, continued his treks to the free Sunday dinners at the Hare Krishna temple, and wore a down jacket in the heatless garage apartment he rented for $20 a month. When he needed money, he found work at the psychology department lab maintaining the electronic equipment that was used for animal behavior experiments. Occasionally, Chris Ann Brennan would come to visit. Their relationship sputtered along erratically, but mostly he tended to the stirrings of his own soul and personal quest for enlightenment. I came of age at a magical time, he reflected later. Our consciousness was raised by Zen and also by LSD. Even later in life, he would credit psychedelic drugs for making him more enlightened. Taking LSD was a profound experience, one of the most important things in my life. LSD shows you that there's another side to the coin, and you can't remember it when it wears off, but you know it. It reinforced my sense of what was important, creating great things instead of making money, putting things back into the stream of history and of human consciousness as much as I could. Atari and India. Zen and the Art of Game Design. Atari. In February 1974, after 18 months of hanging around Reed, Jobs decided to move back to his parents' home in Los Altos and look for a job. It was not a difficult search. At peak times during the 1970s, the classified section of the San Jose Mercury carried up to 60 pages of technology help wanted ads. One of those caught Jobs' eye. "Have fun, make money," it said. That day, Jobs walked into the lobby of the video game manufacturer Atari and told the personnel director, who was startled by his unkempt hair and attire, that he wouldn't leave until they gave him a job. Jobs thus became one of the first 50 employees at Atari, working as a technician for $5 an hour. One reason Jobs was eager to make some money in early 1974 was that Robert Friedland, who had gone to India the summer before, was urging him to take his own spiritual journey there. Friedland had studied in India with Neem Karoli Baba, Maharaji, who had been the guru to much of the 60s hippie movement. When he got off the plane in New Delhi, he felt waves of heat rising from the tarmac, even though it was only April. "I got dysentery pretty fast. I was sick, really sick, a really high fever. I dropped from 160 pounds to 120 in about a week." Once he got healthy enough to move, he decided that he needed to get out of Delhi. He went by train and bus to a village near Nainital in the foothills of the Himalayas. That was where Neem Karoli Baba lived, or had lived. By the time Jobs got there, he was no longer alive, at least in the same incarnation. Jobs rented a room with a mattress on the floor from a family who helped him recuperate by feeding him vegetarian meals. There was a copy there of Autobiography of a Yogi in English that a previous traveler had left, and I read it several times because there was not a lot to do, and I walked around from village to village and recovered from my dysentery. At one point, Jobs was told of a young Hindu holy man who was holding a gathering of his followers at the Himalayan estate of a wealthy businessman. It was a chance to meet a spiritual being and hang out with his followers, but it was also a chance to have a good meal. I could smell the food as we got near, and I was very hungry. As Jobs was eating, the holy man, who was not much older than Jobs, picked him out of the crowd, pointed at him, and began laughing maniacally. He came running over and grabbed me and made a tooting sound and said, "You are just like a baby," recalled Jobs. I was not relishing this attention. Taking Jobs by the hand, he led him out of the worshipful crowd and walked him up to a hill where there was a well and a small pond. We sit down, and he pulls out this straight razor. I'm thinking he's a nutcase and begin to worry. Then he pulls out a bar of soap. I had long hair at the time, and he lathered up my hair and shaved my head. He told me that he was saving my health. During his 7 months in India, he had written to his parents only sporadically, getting mail at the American Express office in New Delhi when he passed through, and so they were somewhat surprised when they got a call from the Oakland airport asking them to pick him up. They immediately drove up from Los Altos. My head had been shaved, I was wearing Indian cotton robes, and my skin had turned a deep chocolate brown red from the sun, he recalled. So I'm sitting there, and my parents walked past me about 5 times, and finally my mother came up and said, "Steve?" And I said, "Hi." They took him back home, where he continued trying to find himself. Years later, sitting in his Palo Alto garden, he reflected on the lasting influence of his trip to India. Western rational thought is not an innate human characteristic. It is learned and is the great achievement of Western civilization. In the villages of India, they never learned it. They learned something else, which is in some ways just as valuable, but in other ways is not. That's the power of intuition and experiential wisdom. Zen has been a deep influence in my life ever since. At one point, I was thinking about going to Japan and trying to get into the Ihiji monastery, but my spiritual advisor urged me to stay here. He said there is nothing over there that isn't here, and he was correct. I learned the truth of the Zen saying that if you are willing to travel around the world to meet a teacher, one will appear next door. Jobs did in fact find a teacher right in his own neighborhood. Shunryu Suzuki, who wrote Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and ran the San Francisco Zen Center, used to come to Los Altos every Wednesday evening to lecture and meditate with a small group of followers. After a while, he asked his assistant, Kobun Chino Atagawa, to open a full-time center there. Jobs became a faithful follower. I ended up spending as much time as I could with him, Jobs recalled. They sometimes discussed whether Jobs should devote himself fully to spiritual pursuits, but Kobun counseled otherwise. He assured Jobs that he could keep in touch with his spiritual side while working in a business. The relationship turned out to be lasting and deep. 17 years later, Kobun would perform Jobs' wedding ceremony. Jobs' compulsive search for self-awareness also led him to undergo primal scream therapy, which had recently been developed and popularized by a Los Angeles psychotherapist named Arthur Janov. It was based on the Freudian theory that psychological problems are caused by the repressed pains of childhood. Jobs confided to close friends that he was driven by the pain he was feeling about being put up for adoption and not knowing about his birth parents. He had learned from Paul and Clara Jobs that his birth parents had both been graduate students at a university and that his father might be Syrian. He had even thought about hiring a private investigator, but he decided not to do so for the time being. "I didn't want to hurt my parents," he recalled, referring to Paul and Clara. Jobs later said that Janov's teachings did not prove very useful, but Elizabeth Holmes contended that it made him more confident. After he did it, he was in a different place. His confidence improved, and his feelings of inadequacy were reduced. Jobs came to believe that he could impart that feeling of confidence to others and thus push them to do things they hadn't thought possible. Holmes had broken up with Kotke and joined a religious cult in San Francisco that expected her to sever ties with all past friends. But Jobs rejected that injunction. He arrived at the cult house in his Ford Ranchero one day and announced that he was driving up to Friedland's apple farm and she was to come. Even more brazenly, he said she would have to drive part of the way, even though she didn't know how to use the stick shift. Once we got on the open road, he made me get behind the wheel, and he shifted the car until we got up to 55 miles per hour, she recalled. Then he puts on a tape of Dylan's Blood on the Tracks, lays his head in my lap, and goes to sleep. He had the attitude that he could do anything, and therefore so can you. He put his life in my hands, so that made me do something I didn't think I could do. It was the brighter side of what would become known as his reality distortion field. If you trust him, you can do things, Holmes said. If he's decided that something should happen, then he's just going to make it happen. The Apple I. Turn on, boot up, jack in. In San Francisco and the Santa Clara Valley during the late 1960s, various cultural currents flowed together. There was the technology revolution that began with the growth of military contractors and soon included electronics firms, microchip makers, video game designers, and computer companies. There was a hacker subculture filled with wireheads, freakers, cyberpunks, hobbyists, and just plain geeks that included engineers who didn't conform to the HP mold and their kids who weren't attuned to the wavelengths of the subdivisions. There were quasi-academic groups doing studies on the effects of LSD. Participants included Doug Engelbart of the Augmentation Research Center in Palo Alto, who later helped develop the computer mouse and graphical user interfaces, and Ken Kesey, who celebrated the drug with music and light shows featuring a house band that became the Grateful Dead. There was the hippie movement, born out of the Bay Area's Beat generation, and the rebellious political activists, born out of the free speech movement at Berkeley. Overlaid on it all were various self-fulfillment movements pursuing paths to personal enlightenment, Zen and Hinduism, meditation and yoga, primal scream and sensory deprivation, Esalen and Est. This fusion of flower power and processor power, enlightenment and technology, was embodied by Steve Jobs as he meditated in the mornings, audited physics classes at Stanford, worked nights at Atari, and dreamed of starting his own business. There was just something going on here, he said, looking back at the time and place. The best music came from here. The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Joan Baez, Janis Joplin, and so did the integrated circuit, and things like the Whole Earth catalog. Initially, the technologists and the hippies did not interface well. But by the early 1970s, a shift was underway. Timothy Leary declared that personal computers had become the new LSD and revised his famous mantra to proclaim, "Turn on, boot up, jack in." The musician Bono, who later became a friend of Jobs, often discussed with him why those immersed in the rock, drugs, rebel counterculture of the Bay Area ended up helping to create the personal computer industry. The people who invented the 21st century were pot-smoking, sandal-wearing hippies from the West Coast like Steve because they saw differently, he said. One person who encouraged the denizens of the counterculture to make common cause with the hackers was Stuart Brand, a puckish visionary who generated fun and ideas over many decades. Brand was a participant in one of the early 60s LSD studies in Palo Alto. He joined with his fellow subject, Ken Kesey, to produce the acid-celebrating Trips Festival, appeared in the opening scene of Tom Wolfe's The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, and worked with Doug Engelbart to create a seminal sound and light presentation of new technologies called the mother of all demos. Most of our generation scorn computers as the embodiment of centralized control, Brand later noted, but a tiny contingent, later called hackers, embraced computers and set about transforming them into tools of liberation. That turned out to be the true royal road to the future. Brand ran the Whole Earth Truck Store, which began as a roving truck that sold useful tools and educational materials, and in 1968 he decided to extend its reach with the Whole Earth catalog. In 1968, on its first cover, was the famous picture of Earth taken from space. Its subtitle was Access to Tools. Jobs became a Whole Earth fan. He was particularly taken by the final issue, which came out in 1971 when he was still in high school, and he brought it with him to college and then to the All One Farm. On the back cover of their final issue was a photograph of an early morning country road, the kind you might find yourself hitchhiking on if you were so adventurous. Beneath it were the words, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." People's Computer Company was not a company at all, but a newsletter and organization with the motto, Computer Power to the People. There were occasional Wednesday night potluck dinners, and two of the regulars, Gordon French and Fred Moore, decided to create a more formal club where news about personal electronics could be shared. They were energized by the arrival of the January 1975 issue of Popular Mechanics, which had on its cover the first personal computer kit, the Altair.